I didn't realize how much time flies, so I want to bring in Jodi because she's going to be part of the what is to be done discussion, but I want her here also. So Jodi, welcome. Jodi Dean, thank you so much, political theorist, author, and editor of 13 books.
Thanks so much for having me on. Right. First, I want to say, like, I used to agree with Dan and Sam, right? I used to, in the beginning of the Trump administration, I thought that the language of fascism was really super overblown. And I don't think that anymore. But I don't think it's because it's not about Trump the person. It's about the mobilization of a particular mob, right? I mean, it's a reaction to the present mob. And I think it's important not to remain attached to a diagnosis that might have made a lot of sense 2 or 3 years ago, but doesn't make as much sense right now. Like Sam's argument's like, well, you know, if you call it fascism, that's not a hegemonic use of fascism. It doesn't the diagnosis that comes out of the knowledge of the Jim Crow South isn't one that's widely shared. It's kind of marginalized or something like that. We got to ask, well, why was that diagnosis marginalized? That was itself because of anti-communism in the United States. It's because of the fascist tendencies under McCarthyism that made that diagnosis not take hold, right? That's part of the symptoms. And I want to go back on the question of the depth of the diagnosis that America, that particularly the South, under Jim Crow and the structure of the Southern state through white supremacy, that diagnosis as fascist goes back way before World War II. You can find it already in texts that are using the Scottsboro Boys case to connect with the in Italy's invasion of Ethiopia and arguing that anyone who's going to stand up against fascism abroad has to stand up against fascism at home.
And Black Abraham Lincoln Brigade fight.
Absolutely.
Black African Americans who went to fight in Spain, right? Who were called proto-fascists. So. Anti-fascist, proto-anti-fascist, sorry.
So there's a powerful argument here that is deeply embedded in U.S. history that needs to be brought out. And I do agree, though, with Sam. It's like you don't win anything by calling all of Trump's supporters fascists. That's true. But what you can do is use the diagnosis to divide Trump supporters, divide the Republican Party, and start to create like a different set of connections between the left. I mean, fascism arises when the left is weak, or when the political system has suppressed the left and prevented the left from giving expression to popular grievances. So the left needs to strengthen itself and not just dismiss any old Republican as a fascist, but carefully explain, here are the legacies of fascism, here are their current incarceration, their incarnations, and don't be on that side.
Jodi just said everything I believe. I do take for me the civil rights. So I want to set out some points to see where we are. I think there's an empirical question, like if I believed what Daniel believed about the role of the word fascism in American history, I was going to say earlier, then I might have his position, but I don't believe that. But then Jodi came in and said, even if that were so, even if that were hegemonic, why should we let it be hegemonic? It's the fascist element in American society that makes it hegemonic. We need to contest that. And that was very powerful. That didn't occur to me as a response. And that's moving and powerful, because the tradition that Jodi and Eugene are speaking of is a tradition that is so meaningful for me, and is so meaningful in American history, the anti-fascist tradition. So I think that Daniel made a point, and I wanted to say I empirically disagreed with it, but now I don't have to even say it. It's sort of, though that empirical disagreement is irrelevant. His point was, here's the effect of using fascism, and Jodi just so powerfully said, well, let's challenge that hegemony, and speak up for the communist past of America, frankly. Which gets minimized in these discussions. The role of communist organizations in Black liberation, the role of George Jackson, and these are the people who used fascism. And Jodi is absolutely right that we need to represent for that tradition. Now, just to address Sam's point, and Sam and I talk about this on our walks and our discussions.
social distance box, I hope.
The need to, the role of, the fact that you can't call 74 million people fascists, that's not true. I remember Peter Gordon was talking to my wife, and Peter Gordon was saying, a lot of people who voted for the Nazis weren't fascists. They weren't fascists. They were just ordinary conservatives who were scared of communists and that was in fact a lot of the base of the voting base of the fascists. And my wife looked at him and said, my partner looked at him and said, "If you vote for the fascists, aren't you a fascist?" So now I don't think that's right, but he was even saying that many members of the Nazi Party weren't Nazis. Peter was saying many members of the Nazi Party weren't Nazis at all, and he was saying this to her. So her point was, if you're a member of the Nazi Party, aren't you a fascist? So it's certainly correct. History tells us, even in the and Daniel was talking about causes. My work isn't about causes. I'm a philosopher. What's happening in India has different causes than what's happening in Brazil, and what's happening in the United States, and what's happening in Germany at different causes than what's happening in Italy. I'm a philosopher. I'm talking about politics and rhetoric. Causes, those differ, and those are relevant. But yeah, of course, there's going to be different causes in different countries. But as a philosopher, you're looking at a uniform structure. And finally, Sam's point. So to address Sam's point about how do you address the political efficacy of fascism, Jodi already answered this. Basically, it's efficacious insofar as it splits people. It says, actually, so there's a lot more people who are basically, everyone on this panel is going to agree, fascist, and there's many more than there were 4 years ago, because frankly, when the president of the United States does that from the podium, that creates it. But obviously, most of the people who voted for Trump, the vast majority, are not that. So Sam is right. You cannot, but Jodi, let me just address the point about the civil rights movement to defend Eugene's analysis, and then I'll stop. So Sam is right. The civil rights movement was an attempt to convince people, but it was not an attempt to convince. It was not an attempt to convince the fascists in the South. They knew they were not going to convince the fascists in the South. It was an attempt to convince people not there that there was a real fascist problem in the South. So that's why they got beaten on Edmund Pettus Bridge. When I spoke at the University of Alabama in 2017 in the program on race and gender, and I was with these young people whose grandparents were part of the civil rights movement, and told me about the group that stayed there. And, one of them was like, yeah, my grandmother raises her pants leg every Christmas and says, this is where Bull Connor's dogs bit me. And they were armed, they in the South, I think, like, people, those old school civil rights movement and people 30 years old, they are armed because they know that there are, in fact, they're not going to do much convincing with some groups in the South, and the civil rights movement was trying to show America that was in the South. Yeah, and can I actually ask Jodi? I wanted to ask you because you touched on this, but I think a lot of people aren't totally, and I unmuted you there, aren't that familiar with the kind of anti-communist organizing, anti-communist history, and how that has created an opening for fascism.
So I think if we just start with the McCarthy era, we can remind people about the trials that the 12 leading members, actually it ended up being 11, of the Communist Party were subjected to, sentenced to prison. Some people were deported. Paul Robeson was a major Black communist leader. His passport was denied and he was basically hounded. What people often forget is that a lot of the leadership of the Communist Party in the late 30s, early 40s through the very early 50s were leaders in anti-racist struggle, anti-white supremacist struggle. They were Black leaders. They ran Black candidates. And so the attack on communists was also an attack on people fighting against the segregated South. They were fighting against Jim Crow laws. There's a really interesting book on what happens to the professional McCarthy witnesses after those after those trials kind of wind down. They move south and become professional defenders of segregation. And one of their arguments is, we have to oppose segregation because that brings in communists, and we have to oppose communists because that brings in desegregation. And so there's a super tight link in the middle of the 20th century that continues to today between the anti-racist struggle and a struggle and opposition to anti-racism being framed as communist, and in part because communists were anti-racist. Right. And so folks when the far right accuses Pelosi and all the rest of them as being communists, they're not just regurgitating an old, tired, red baiting rhetoric. They're also doing a dog whistle racist politics, right? That legacy is strong in the right, and we need to acknowledge that and be specific. And so people who are anti-communist need to recognize who their bedfellows are.
Yeah, if only, and it's also not fair to call her that because then it gets our hopes up. Just kidding. We don't actually think she's a communist. And so this has been a great dialogue and discussion about kind of the origins, and there's obviously still a lot that we could be mining and discussing, but I wanted to kind of shift this towards what can be done now. Like, how does this discussion inform what we do moving forward? And I do think an important question is the divide and conquer versus alienate. Like, how do we talk about this or organize around this in a way that, because there is some annoying Mick resistance discourse, which is like, everyone is a fascist, everyone who voted for this person, like the blood is on your hands. And then there's also, we have to be acknowledge what happened at the Capitol, but also how that fits into the larger, not just history, but recent history. And how we do take this into account when we organize.
I think that one of the crucial things there is the language and the charge that this was a fascist mob with fascist intent is important because it can break down the sort of both sidism that is too prominent, and it can be a wedge against reconciliation. I mean, we can fully accept, this is again where I don't completely share Daniel's current analysis. I'm not worried about Biden using the words or the diagnosis of fascist, because I'm more worried about him using the language of reconciliation and moving together and building unity. We know he can work with segregationists, and so that's part of his appeal. We have to fight against that. And this charge, the situating of the current struggle in history and the recognition that it is a fascist, that this has been a fascist movement, helps us put a wedge against that kind of rehabilitation of what's ostensibly a segregationist kind of reconciliation. Right? That's got to be off the table. Unity at all cost is not unity. Unity at all cost is oppression and exploitation.
Okay, I want to ask you more about that, but Daniel, I thought I saw your hand go up
just very quickly. I think we do fundamentally disagree about the constellation of forces, which is then just going to necessarily influence what we emphasize at what moment. So I think Jodi's absolutely right with that. I just wanted to make clear I wasn't referring to Biden himself, but the sort of permanent security state that has expanded since 9/11. I don't think it really matters what Joe Biden himself does. I think it has to do with a broader social logic of surveillance and endless imperialist war that has been endorsed by every American president since 1945, including Barack Obama, George W. Bush, Clinton, and everyone before them. So I think that is a very extraordinarily powerful social institution that has more influence in shaping what happens in this country. And it has the most influence when it's given a blank check by sort of the liberal establishment and liberal elite. So I'm worried that, like this elite has done for decades since 9/11, it will use this present crisis for its own ends. And I think that's a real fear. I think it's happened over and over again.
Sam and then Jason.
I love what everyone said, and I admired Jodi greatly. I would just put a bit more focus on the Democratic Party in this moment, and not so much on Biden, who's kind of a figurehead for the kind of mainstream of the Democrats who won. And for all that we might like to make a counter-hegemonic tradition of anti-fascism, more significant, we're facing a moment in which this anti-fascist idea is having this function, which we can't deny, of liquidating the Democrats' sin as if they aren't implicated in the coming of Trump, as if their form of race consciousness is remotely adequate to our moment. And January 6th, I think, in the long run, will sadly come to be seen as a moment that strengthened the Democrats' complacency as they head into 4 years of governing. So I think Danny's raising some concerns about overreaction, and it's warranted because of the overreaction we've have seen. Not least when, the prior fascist boogeyman before Trump was Saddam Hussein. But the real fear, I think, is not in that direction. It's normalcy. It's in the assumption for, the kind of anti-fascist Biden is, that America's back now that Trump's gone. And restoring the status quo ante is what it means to reject fascism. And, on this Zoom call, we can, laugh at that and say deeper reform is called for. But it seems as if, this framework is actually serving our enemies then, because it's not focused on their complicity or our recruitment, what it would mean for a new kind of Democratic Party to get real on race, to combine it with class, to appeal to some of the disaffected millions who chose Trump, and which is a very different choice, by the way, than choosing Hitler, with all due respect to Jason.